Continuing with Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche, from where we were at, which was sort of halfway through that section called the cosmological situation today. And he says, behind the Enlightenment Romanticism division in high culture, mirrored in the academic world by the two cultures of science and the humanities, looms the deeper and more ancient cultural schism between science and religion. In the wake of the scientific revolution, many spiritually sensitive individuals have found resources to help them cope with the human condition in the modern cosmological context in ways that, to one extent or another, answer their religious longings and existential needs. Paradoxically, it seems to be this very context, with its absolute erasure of all inherited orders of pre-given cosmic meaning, that has helped make possible in our time an unprecedented freedom, diversity, and authenticity of religious responses to the human condition. These have taken a multitude of forms. The pursuit of the individual spiritual journey, drawing on many sources, the personal leap of faith, the life of ethical service and humanitarian compassion, the inward turn to meditation, prayer, monastic withdrawal, involvement in the great mystical traditions and practices from Asia, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Sufism, and from diverse indigenous and shamanic cultures, native North America, Central and South America, African, Australian, Polynesian, and Old European. Recovery of various Gnostic and esoteric perspectives and practices, the pursuit of psychedelic or entheogenic exploration, devotion to creative artistic expression as a spiritual path, or renewed engagement with revitalized forms of Jewish and Christian traditions, beliefs, and practices. Yet all these engagements have taken place in a cosmos whose basic parameters have been defined by the determinedly non-spiritual epistemology and ontology of modern science. Because of science sovereignty over the external aspect of the modern worldview, these noble spiritual journeys are pursued in a universe whose essential nature is recognized, whether consciously or subconsciously, to be supremely indifferent to those very quests. These many spiritual paths can and do provide meaning, solace, and support, but they have not resolved the fundamental schism of the modern worldview. They cannot heal the deep division latent in every modern psyche. The very nature of the objective universe turns any spiritual faith and ideals into courageous acts of subjectivity, constantly vulnerable to intellectual negation. Only by strenuously avoiding the reality of this contradiction, and thus engaging in what is in essence a form of psychological compartmentalization and denial, can the modern self find any semblance of wholeness. In such circumstances, an integrated worldview, the natural aspiration of every psyche, is unattainable. In such circumstances, an integrated worldview, the natural aspiration of every psyche, is unattainable. An inchoate awareness of this underlies the reaction of religious fundamentalists to modernity, their rigid refusal to join the seemingly impossible spiritual adventure of the modern age. But for the more fully embracing and reflective contemporary sensibility, with its multiple commitments and alertness to the larger dialectic of realities in our time, the conflict cannot be dismissed so readily. The problem with this dissociative condition is not merely a cognitive dissonance or internal distress, nor is it the privatization of spirituality that has become so characteristic of our time. Since the encompassing cosmological context in which all human activity takes place has eliminated any enduring ground of transcendent values, spiritual, moral, and aesthetic, the resulting vacuum has empowered the reductive values of the market and the mass media to colonize the collective human imagination and drain it of all depth. If the cosmology is disenchanted, the world is logically seen in predominantly utilitarian ways, and the utilitarian mindset begins to shape all human motivation at the collective level. What might be considered means to larger ends ineluctably become ends in themselves. The drive to achieve ever greater financial profit, political power, and technological prowess becomes the dominant impulse moving individuals and societies, until these values, despite ritual claims to the contrary, supersede all other aspirations. The disenchanted cosmos impoverishes the collective psyche, in the most global way, vitiating its spiritual and moral imagination. Vitiate not only in the sense of diminish and impair, but also in the sense of deform and debase. In such a context, everything can be appropriated. Nothing is immune. Majestic vistas of nature, great works of art, revered music, eloquent language, the beauty of the human body, distant lands and cultures, extraordinary movements, moments of history, the arousal of deep human emotion, all become advertising tools to manipulate consumer response. For quite literally, in a disenchanted cosmos, nothing is sacred. The soul of the world has been extinguished. Ancient trees and forests can then be seen as nothing but potential lumber. Mountains, nothing but mineral deposits. Seashores and deserts are oil reserves. Lakes and rivers are engineering tools. Animals are perceived as harvestable commodities. Indigenous tribes as obstructing relics of an outmoded past. Children's minds as marketing targets. At the all-important cosmological level, the spiritual dimension of the empirical universe has been entirely negated. And with it, any publicly affirmable encompassing ground for moral wisdom and restraint. The short term and the bottom line rule all. Whether in politics, business, or the media, the lowest common denominator of the culture increasingly governs discourse and prescribes the values of the whole. Myopically obsessed with narrow goals and narrow identities, the powerful blind themselves to the larger suffering and crisis of the global community. In a world where the subject is experiencing as living in and above and against a world of objects, other people and cultures are more readily perceived as simply other objects, inferior in value to oneself, to ignore or exploit for one's own purposes, as are other forms of life, biosystems, the planetary whole. Moreover, the underlying anxiety and disorientation that pervade modern societies in the face of a meaningless cosmos create both a collective psychic numbness and a desperate spiritual hunger, leading to an addictive, insatiable craving for ever more material goods to fill the inner emptiness and producing a manic techno-consumerism that cannibalizes the planet. Highly practical consequences ensue from the disenchanted modern worldview. The ambition to emancipate ourselves as autonomous subjects by objectifying the world has in a sense come full circle, returned to haunt us by turning the human self into an object as well. An ephemeral side effect of a random universe, an isolated atom in mass society, a statistic, a commodity, passive prey to the demands of the market, prisoner of the self-constructed modern iron cage. Thus, Weber's famous prophecy, quote, "No one knows who will live in this cage in the future, or whether at the end of this tremendous development entirely new prophets will arise, or there will be a great rebirth of old ideals and ideas, or if neither, mechanized petrification embellished with a sort of convulsive self-importance." For of the last stage of this cultural development, it might well be truly said, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart, this nullity imagines that it has achieved, this nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. Defined in the end by its disenchanted context, the human self, too, is inevitably disenchanted. Ultimately, it becomes, like everything else, a mere object of material forces and efficient causes. A sociobiological pawn, a selfish gene, a meme machine, a biotechnological artifact, an unwitting tool of its own tools. For the cosmology of a civilization both reflects and influences all human activity, motivation, and self-understanding that take place within its parameters. It is the container for everything else. This, therefore, has become the looming question of our time. What is the ultimate impact of cosmological disenchantment on a civilization? What does it do to the human self, year after year, century after century? to experience existence as a conscious, purposeful being in an unconscious, purposeless universe? What is the price of a collective belief in absolute cosmic indifference? What are the consequences of this unprecedented cosmological context for the human experiment, indeed for the entire planet? It was Nietzsche who seems to have recognized most intensely the full implications of the modern development and experienced in his own being the inescapable plight of the modern sensibility. The romantic soul, at once liberated, displaced, and entrapped within the vast cosmic void of the scientific universe. Using hyper-Copernican imagery to depict the dizzying annihilation of the metaphysical world and death of God wrought by the modern mind, and reflecting that peculiarly tragic combination of self-determining will and inexorable fate, Nietzsche captured the pathos of the late modern existential and spiritual crisis. Quote, "What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us?" If we look again at the diagram illustrating the difference between the primal and the modern experience of the world, taking into account the full effect of the post-Copernican, post-Nietzschean situation, we see the extremity of the late modern human's differentiation and alienation in the cosmos in Figure 4. Figure 4, which is here. The source of all meaning and purpose in the universe has become at once infinitesimally small and utterly peripheral. The lonely island of human meaning is now so incongruent, so accidental, so ephemeral, so fundamentally estranged from its vast surrounding matrix, as to have become, in many senses, insupportable. Yet it is perhaps the very starkness and self-contradictory absurdity of this situation that suggests the possibility of another perspective. The modern mind has long prided itself on its repeated success in overcoming anthropomorphic distortions in its understanding of reality. It has constantly sought to purify its worldview from any naive anthropocentrism and self-fulfilling projections. Each revolution in modern thought, from Copernicus onward, each great insight associated with a canonical name in the grand procession, from Bacon and Descartes, Hume and Kant to Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, Weber, Freud, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, Kuhn, and the entire postmodern turn, has brought forth in its own manner another essential revelation of an unconscious bias that had until then blinded the human mind in its attempts to understand the world. The gist and consequence of this long, incomparably intricate modern and postmodern epistemological development has been to compel us with ever-increasing acuity to recognize how our most fundamental assumptions and principles, so long taken for granted as to fully escape our notice, imperceptibly bring into being the very world we consider unarguably objective. As the post-Kuhnian philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend recognized, quote, "A change of universal principles brings about a change of the entire world. Speaking in this manner, we no longer assume an objective world that remains unaffected by our epistemic activities, except when moving within the confines of a particular point of view. We concede that our epistemic activities may have a decisive influence, even upon the most solid piece of cosmological furniture. They may make gods disappear and replace them by heaps of atoms in empty space. That was Feyerabend. Now to Tarnas, who says, "Let us then take our strategy of critical self-reflection one crucial and perhaps inevitable step further. Let us apply it to the fundamental governing assumption and starting point of the modern worldview, the pervasive assumption that subtly continues to influence the postmodern turn as well, that any meaning and purpose the modern mind perceives in the universe does not exist intrinsically in the universe, but is constructed and projected onto it by the human mind. Might not this be the final, most global anthropocentric delusion of all? For is it not an extraordinary act of human hubris, literally a hubris of cosmic proportions, to assume that the exclusive source of all meaning and purpose in the universe is ultimately centered in the human mind, which is therefore absolutely unique and special and in this sense superior to the entire cosmos? To presume that the universe utterly lacks what we human beings, the offspring and expression of that universe, conspicuously possess? To assume that the part somehow radically differs from and transcends the whole? To base our entire worldview on the a priori principle that whenever human beings perceive any patterns of psychological and spiritual significance in the non-human world, any signs of interiority and mind, any suggestion of purposely coherent order and intelligible meaning, there must be understood. These must be understood as no more than human constructions and projections, as ultimately rooted in the human mind and never in the world. Perhaps this complete voiding of the cosmos, this absolute privileging of the human, is the ultimate act of anthropocentric projection, the most subtle yet prodigious form of human self-aggrandizement. Perhaps the modern mind has been projecting soullessness and mindlessness on a cosmic scale, systematically filtering and eliciting all data according to its self-evaluating assumptions, self-elevating assumptions, at the very moment we believed we were cleansing our mind of distortions. Have we been living in a self-produced bubble of cosmic isolation? Perhaps the very attempt to de-anthropomorphize reality in such an absolute and simplistic manner is itself a supremely anthropocentric act. I believe that this criticism of the hidden anthropocentrism permeating the modern worldview cannot be successfully countered. Only the blinders of our paradigm, as is always the case, have prevented us from recognizing the profound implausibility of its most basic underlying assumption. For as we gaze out now at the immense starry heavens surrounding our precious planet, and as we contemplate the long and richly diverse history of human thinking about the world, must we not consider that our strangely unique modern commitment to restrict all meaning and purposive intelligence to ourselves, and refusing these to the great cosmos within which we've emerged, we might in fact be drastically underestimating and misperceiving that cosmos, and thus misperceiving, at once overestimating and underestimating ourselves as well. Perhaps the greater Copernican revolution is in a sense still incomplete, still unfolding. Perhaps a long-hidden form of anthropocentric bias, increasingly destructive in its consequences, can now at last be recognized, thus opening up the possibility of a richer, more complex, more authentic relationship between the human being and the cosmos. Questions and issues like these compel us to direct our attention with new eyes both outward and inward, not only inward, as we habitually do in our search for meaning, but also outward, as we seldom do because our cosmos has long been regarded as empty of spiritual significance and unable to respond to that search. Yet our gaze outward must be different from before. It must be transformed by a new awareness of the interior. The questions and issues we've confronted here require us to explore yet more deeply the nature of the self that seeks to comprehend the world. They press us to discern more clearly how our subjectivity, that tiny peripheral island of meaning in the cosmic vastness, subtly participates in configuring and constellating the entire universe we perceive and know. They compel us to examine that mysterious place where subject and object so intricately and consequentially intersect, the crucial meeting point of cosmology, epistemology, and psychology. Okay, so that's the end of the section, and I will have a sort of couple of notes to finish this off. So first of all, I sort of have the idea that I'm sort of questioning whether I mean, there's obviously a lot to question throughout all of this, which I mean, it's like a reasonable take, but it's not like a perfect take. Again, published in 2006. I don't really see how someone can go through Stan Grof and Carl Jung and then sort of not discuss a cosmology that's informed by deep psychedelic exploration. I think we're by no means we're not really in yet a position to establish a substantially new cosmology because we haven't integrated the um, depth of self and world transformation that exploration brings about, and we would need to do that first. And that wasn't mentioned at all here. Also, it's not that I don't think that the new worldview, whatever it might be, it's not exactly based on principles. It's kind of not about that. It's more that these different schisms that were named are resolved by being integrated rather than new principles being found. Where there are new principles found, I would be suspicious of them. The question is, how do the people pointing to those principles, how are they living? Are they able to integrate these in their life, in their body? There's a couple of other things here. Yeah, so there's a couple of it's like how we relate to the human. And in a way, he's sort of talking about this sort of radical displacement from the cosmic center that the Copernican stuff brought about. The idea being that this in itself may be a kind of illusion. Um, and this would imply, like, if we see that sort of cosmology, that worldview, sort of radically, yeah, voids all of the meaning and purpose and like that, then the idea would be that we need to recognize that we are actually still at the cosmic center in a certain way. We need to recognize that, but in a way that avoids reifying anthropocentrism. So in a way that the position of the human in all this is, I think, can be regarded as having crucial importance. But we just need to not, that doesn't mean that we're like superior to all the rest, you know? It's kind of hard to imagine, hard to imagine that. Yeah, I think he didn't mention explicitly that it seems to me that the issue throughout all this is this sort of presumed egoic identity. It's when we've been talking about the self, I think he's been talking about the ego. And that sort of understandably feels insecure when displaced by and from God. And so there's a way that if we can sort of deeply reimagine, get a deeper sense of who we are, then we can sort of avoid identifying with the ego in this way, and therefore sort of avoid being so displaced and moved around so easily because we're sort of connecting with a deeper center within ourselves. That seems quite obvious, but wasn't mentioned. A couple of other points. Yeah, I think cosmologies aren't just thought up out of nowhere. They're sort of, I think cosmology comes about as a result of properly integrating uh, profound experience, deep experience, mystical experience, high states of consciousness, revelation. Um, yeah, I think if we can regard that kind of truth as far more significant than we've realized that it is, then that's the path to a new cosmology. I don't see that that's really avoidable because the whole point is to sort of play the game a little bit differently than the way that science has been playing it. And that involves like restoring our access to kinds of truth, namely religious experiential truth that science sort of believed was not really real and in fact is. And we've just been cut off from that. A science that integrated all that, including spirituality and so on, would imply a new science. We need a new science. And that's kind of a big, that's kind of big news. There was a couple of other small things. Firstly, that like, yes, our epistemology has this profound significance in that, as Feyerabend said, a change in our universal principles brings about a change in the entire world. Um, so we can sort of make the gods disappear in that way. But this would also have to apply to the actual furniture, not just the cosmological furniture. And so there's a way that we we have to recognize the power of our epistemology for sort of defining what something is. And this is very hard to do in a world where the object seems so clear. It's like, because the scientist would say, look, it's an object. See, here it is. And we're actually questioning that. We're saying that no, our epistemology actually is dictating what's going on in a profound way. And we would need to use Heidegger and others to reveal that that's not the case. And that involves a lot of work. It's going to take, yeah, centuries. Yeah, and then he was sort of buying into this self and world dichotomy some more. So the whole point would be not just to understand that yes, the cosmos is a source of meaning and like that, but and we don't have to put ourselves in this sort of anthropocentric center of being better than all the rest. But the whole point is that sort of we are the cosmos, and we still need we need a love of the world and a love of the self. We sort of need both. And I think that what I'm seeking for is a reimagining of a deep sense of who we are, such that we recognize that we are actually constituted by, we actually are this self-world relation. And if we can reveal that and point to that and show that and sense that, then this is a path to deeper appreciation, deeper love, deeper sense, deeper feeling for ourselves and the world. And in this way, we can understand that we are both in a way that involves spiritual practice, mystical experience, revelation, and so on, prophetic philosophy, etc., as I've been talking about in other places. Um, this is a path to both understanding why and how the human is at the center in a certain way, without being anthropocentric and without sort of putting ourselves on the top of the pyramid. Um, and I think this sort of yeah, buying into the postmodern deconstructionism of sort of um, he's sort of putting it all on the modern self even more and sort of saying, oh, maybe it's us that's the problem. It's kind of like, no, that's the whole point, not to do that. Okay, and so that's more or less all. And I'm going to continue with a little bit more of the second chapter that I wanted to do, which finally gets towards synchronicity.